But I'm just going to spend 15 minutes giving you a little bit of an insight into maybe how we can take all of these ideas and put something together. But before we go there, I think one of the really interesting things, because they're doing an awful lot of stuff, I'm being blinded here. I need to move somewhere else. They're doing a really interesting studies on which are the companies that made it post-COVID, accelerated their growth versus which are the ones that kind of faltered, and what was the real differences between the two. And even when you take the big five out of it, because we're all sick of hearing about Amazon and Google and Facebook and nobody cares anymore, right? But even if you take those guys out of the mix, the innovators who really accelerated growth prioritized five things during COVID. 3 of those things were directly linked to performance management. So that is when we were all sitting in a crisis, having a meltdown, thinking we might just die, and so might our families. These guys were setting clear ambition. They were prioritizing performance management, and they were developing talent and culture, all things that sit in the performance management framework. And look at the returns they saw as a result. And if that's not convincing enough, Burson has a really interesting study out about organizational performance and culture right now. And he's done an awful lot of work to show the direct links between doing specific things in your culture that impact performance management and what you get out of it. So the business case is clearer than crystal now, because you are now 20 times more likely to exceed your financial targets. You're 6 times more likely to be an industry leader, and all of the other good stuff that goes with it. We can all read stats, but the point is that we can now go to the business and go, actually, of all the things we do in HR, performance management is going to make the biggest impact to your financial results. Now we've got the CEO's attention. Now he's listening, right? Because before that, he's like, I don't care if you do 3 boxes, 4 boxes, but nobody cares. But now we can show the impact of what we're doing with performance management. So it's really worth taking the time to think about, is it as good as it could be? I really like this McKinsey study because they talk about the organizations who transform and which are the transformations that embed. Because as any of your organizations not transforming, we're all transforming, right? We're either doing digital or we're doing AI or we're buying a company or we're merging a company. I don't think there is a company in the room that isn't going through some sort of transformation. You don't get to sit still anymore. But which are the transformations that really stick and sustain over time? And what are they doing differently compared to all the organizations who try for transformation and fail, and it just all became a fad, and didn't we do that once and we've all forgotten about it since? Well, here's the next good news. An awful lot of what they do, monthly, quarterly reviews of performance, objective target setting, individual performance dialogues, all performance management. So here's the great news for HR. We've never been more important. We've never been more critical for business performance. And I think that's the beauty of performance management, is that there's nothing else in HR like it that directly impacts the bottom line of your company. So it is a C-suite topic. It is a CEO topic, and there's new ways to do it. And that's what I want to talk to you about. And I think this has come up a few times today on the performance culture gap. And what are we seeing? And I think sometimes the C-suite can be a little deluded that we are going in this new direction and we have all of these strategic priorities going forward. And you hear it a lot from CEOs and C-suite, hybrid's kind of, tripping us up because it was easier when everyone was in the office. We'd all knew we were going in a certain direction. We'd all figure it out in the office. And hybrid is really the problem. But hybrid's really not the problem. It's the lack of clarity of expectations. It's us being very, very clear about this is what we're doing. That means all these other things we used to do have to die. They have to go away. We have to stop doing them. But really hard to do, right? Because that was somebody's pet project. Somebody came up with that. Somebody works on it. It's somebody's baby. It's really hard to kill things in organizations. When work happens, we just layer on more and more work and we hope people don't break. Actually, we have to get super disciplined. And this is where performance management can really come in to go, we only work on the things that matter, that the C-suite have said are an organizational priority. And that's really one of the things. So many times over the years, I've talked to people and we've sat in rooms endlessly debating OKRs versus SMART versus agile. That's not the point. The point isn't the structure of the goal framework. Look, you can get ChatGPT to create the goal now and do your complete milestones and deliverables and all that kind of good stuff. what's really important is the alignment between what people are doing on a daily basis with what their team is doing, with what their organization is doing, and being able to demonstrate that alignment and being able to bring it back into the CEOs and show those reports of this is what your people are working on at a glance. And that's, of course, what is really important to us in beqom. And of course, technology helps a lot there too. The other thing is that I think a lot of the time the C-suite think, oh, well, we have performance management. We probably have an ERP or SAP or an Oracle, or somebody is looking after performance management. It happens in our organization. But to the employee who doesn't get regular feedback and coaching, it's not real for them. It's a forgotten process that happens once or twice a year. And it's not connected in the natural flow of work. And I think that's where we can become unstuck. But this is where we have the greatest opportunity to impact, is bringing performance management into the everyday flow of work. And we're really passionate about that. It's like you shouldn't have to leave your emails to be able to conduct performance management on a daily basis. You should be able to give and request feedback, not on email, because that's not the place for it, but to be able to do things in your natural flow of work and be able to check in with your people, have good feedback practices, build clarity and priorities very easily on a day-to-day basis. But all this alignment that I think a lot of us have referenced today, it isn't as easy as it looks. And I think one of the things that we are underestimating sometimes is the level of team centricity that happens in organizations today. People work in teams now. It's not the individualism of the 90s. Most organizations worked in a very individualistic way, even through the 2000s. But now the team is king. So now you have to really turn around the whole team to move in a new direction. And sometimes the team don't want to move in a new direction. Sometimes the team are quite happy where they are because it was their project and they created it and now they own it. And you're asking them to do something entirely new and to throw everything up in the air because some ChatGPT arrived, you know. So teams are much harder to move around if we don't have that really strong alignment. So one of the things that we're really passionate about, and I love the analogy that Dennis did of the side-by-side sitting beside you, because that's exactly the way we see performance. It's got to be a side-by-side. And we have a passport model, which is really hard to explain to you without seeing the tech. So please do come see the tech. Oh, my colleagues are down the back dying to show you. But we have this idea that the employee is center stage and owns the performance piece. We can't have employees rocking up to managers going, how did I do? You know, they should already know. They should arrive with objective data to it. So we have lots of nudging and so on built into our technology, which is, hey, go get yourself some feedback. Go fill up your passport. And the idea of a passport is, you know, when you enter a new country, when you have to get to the other side, you have to kind of rock up and show your documents. The same sort of concept. It's like, get your employees proactive about going out, getting feedback for themselves, being very clear about where they're at with their goals, showing what their contribution has been, give them a role to show what the contribution is. And then the beauty of that is when the employee gets good at this, and we see it a lot in organizations, employees are filling up the passport and they're very proud of their passport. The managers will go, shoot, if they're coming up with all their favorite feedback from their favorite colleagues, I better go out and find a little bit of feedback. And the beauty is that you have two people now kind of building up the objectivity and reducing all the subjectivity and bias that was associated with managers only having one view and telling people if they were good or bad. That is not performance management. We need to really bring in the crowdsourced feedback, that continuous feedback flow that naturally can happen in organizations when you just structure people to go look for it. And we work with a lot of companies to build their feedback cultures because it's not the most natural, normal thing in the world to go, hey, can I have a bit of feedback? It feels kind of uncomfortable. So there is an art to it, and we can help colleagues get there. But you've got to really work on building a feedback culture. You can't decide just everyone should go out and look for feedback. That's not going to happen. And the key is that you build all of this data into purposeful conversations. And regardless of whether you're a 4 check-in organization or a 6 check-in organization or just a 2, one of the things that a lot of companies became unstuck on is because they brought in this continuous performance management. They brought in feedback, they brought in check-ins, but the check-ins were not useful or purposeful. And they just became about the work. You know, we ended up talking about the work, not the person behind the work, how that person could grow, how that person could evolve, what is harder than it should be around here. What are the blockers to you delivering next month? You're not at your numbers? Okay, how do we get there? So the check-ins are really designed to be all about unblocking the barriers that hold us back. Because in the end, nobody wants to wake up and underperform. Very few people really have that intention. Everybody wants to perform well. So having that side-by-side piece of managers and employees work together to unblock the blockers. And it's really simple moments. It's like the key questions and things that will really help unblock, you know, things like, what's harder than it should be around here? That opens up a multitude of answers for you, of going, oh, I didn't know the team was working like that, or I didn't know that these things were, or you couldn't get any help out of finance, or you didn't have the support that you needed here or there. It unblocks a multitude just asking those right questions. The other thing that I think happened with check-ins was people forgot to insert moments of accountability, and that's really key. You've got to have those moments where we go, are we good? Are we on track? Or are you off track, actually? You're not where you should be at. Or we're doing great, you know, but we do need to have those moments of real clarity built into the process. And for the people who got really excited about the new performance management and throughout reviews and ratings, it worked really, really well for some. But for the people who forgot to put those moments of accountability back into performance management, it really didn't work well for them. And they ended up kind of bringing back in the ratings because it just, you know, wasn't a runner for them. But there's lots of people it did work for, who actually just made sure that those moments of accountability existed. So if you're redesigning the conversations that people have, the mid-year review, the end-year review, the quarterly check-in, just think long and hard about what is the conversation you're navigating those managers and employees through, because it really matters how we frame those conversations. So the other piece is the embedded principles that we think about within it. So one of the things that we see is that leaders now have to work in these boundaryless worlds. You know, there's not necessarily going to be sitting face to face in front of this person when they have those moments of accountability, when they have those check-ins. It might be being done remotely. It could be done digitally. We may not see each other. So leaders really have to step up because they're now living in this boundaryless world. The label of I'm your manager, it doesn't quite bring the same level of reverence that it might have once. People need to know that their managers care. And I think it's back to what Dennis was saying. I need to know you. I need to get to know you, build trust, build a relationship. I know who you are. I know what's getting in your way. That connection and that insight is really, really key. And we got to build our performance management around enabling that to happen. You know, if your performance management is built so that a manager can come in and evaluate somebody and drive a salary review, chances are there's not a lot of connection and insight going on. But if your performance management is built around bridging relationships, driving trust, having moments of accountability, if you prioritize those things in your performance management, chances are you'll have leaders who people care about, as opposed to leaders who have a job title. So I think we really have to set up the leaders for success, because a lot of them are struggling with this boundaryless world. A lot of them just want everyone to come back into the office because it was easier then, you know, but we're not going back there. And we have to create this culture 3.0. It can't be the pre-COVID world, but it can't be the COVID world either. I think we have a new world to define. And that's the exciting part about where performance management is at right now. We can kind of break all the rules and start again if we really want. The other things we see a lot in our conversations with others is the link between performance management and engagement. And I think for a long time that link was really ignored, but because we thought other things drove engagement. We thought, you know, we could get engagement out of other like well-being programs and office perks and socializing and all sorts of the million things that HR did to make sure that people were happy. But actually, if we get performance management right, we don't have to do a whole lot else, because that's where all the trust, that's where all the relationship builds, that's where I know my manager's got my back, that's where I know he'll tell me if I'm off track. He'll do me the honor of saying, hey, you'd be a lot more effective if you did this. It takes trust to have those conversations. There's this lovely 5-to-1 concept that possibly some of you might know, because it works for marriages as well as performance management. But it's basically like, if you give somebody praise 5 times, they feel like you have their back. You have the license to give them constructive feedback, and they're much more accepting of it. So this 5-to-1 is lovely. If you're constantly pointing out, hey, you're doing good here, you're doing good. Okay, you're not doing so good over there. You're really ready to accept that, because you know this person's got my back. They pointed out when I'm doing good. I'm okay taking constructive feedback off them. But if you go straight in and go, hey, you know what, you're really bad at it. No, they're not taking that constructive feedback off you. So even just making sure that we're bridging performance management around concepts like 5-to-1 and so on, it can make a big difference with the relationship that's built, the trust that can be built, and indeed the engagement. And getting performance management right, you can really see your engagement scores rocket. We have a client who literally put people at the center of their performance management. Very strong values around this. Within 6 months, their engagement scores went up 10%. We have clients all over who've moved their NPS from 20 to 47 points, just because they got these conversations right. They built a feedback culture. They made sure that managers navigated their conversations really, really well. So these are the pivotal moments that really engage, because the most important conversations happen in performance management. That's where you define your purpose, why you're doing what you're doing. That's when you talk about your career. That's when you check in. That's when you feel part of a team, because you're part of the team goals, but it's also the moment you get ownership and empowerment over your own goals. So it's really the most valuable elements of your journey. And what we're seeing an awful lot of companies move toward is prioritizing growth over evaluation. I think for too long, we thought, like CFO, we were like, oh, it's all here so we can have a rating, so we can have a comp outcome. And now people are like, well, maybe we're all here because we want to grow that individual. Because if we grow that individual, they'll perform better. And if they perform better en masse, if we have all those average guys who just come in to do 9 to 5, which is basically 70% of your workforce, if they all move their performance by 5 or 10%, tell me that doesn't hit your bottom line. Of course it does. We just saw all the studies earlier on that tell us it does. So if we really believe that it's going to hit the bottom line, moving everybody up 5 to 10%, then we have to work on their growth. Then that's the most important thing that happens, because then we get a real financial outcome from performance management. But if we really design our performance management just to evaluate and give everyone a rating, chances are we're not getting all of this good stuff. So it's what's your intent when you're designing performance management. Being very clear about what it's here to do can send you in all sorts of new directions. So finally, to wrap up from me, performance and compensation are the most important things you're going to do. It's why people join you. It's why people leave you. They're the most valuable conversations you have in your organization. You can have the best well-being program in the world, the most beautiful canteen, and you can even have the games room that nobody uses. But none of those things are going to outdo the conversations that happen in performance and comp. So my plea to you is really make it count. Because it's the good stuff. It's the stuff that can really drive and shift your culture. It's the stuff that makes you a great place to work. It's the stuff that builds relationships. But more importantly, it's the stuff that moves the dial on your business performance. So we'd love to talk to you more about it. We're beqom. Get in touch. We have a great technology to share with you. We'd love to talk to you more and continue the conversation. So thanks very much for your time. I don't know if I take questions.
Yes.
Okay.
If we have some questions, I've certainly got none from our audience. That's a question then, Ashlyn. Your perspectives on the implications for performance management of being a skills-based organization.
Yes, yeah. It's interesting. We talked about this at the workshop earlier on. So a huge amount of people are trying to bring skills into performance management. And because roles are less and less definable, and I think we've all kind of hit a wall with roles, because roles are evolving too fast, and titles aren't even that clear, so it's very hard to compare apples with apples. An awful lot of people are like, well, can we manage You know, can we start managing people on the basis of the accumulation of skills? And then do we start to reward them for skills? The challenges that companies have come up against is there are ways of incorporating skills into performance management. But the challenge is when you go outside of the black and white areas like technology is super easy to bring in skills-based performance management because they have very clear certifications. That means they have a very clear next skill. That means they're worth X on the market. It's really neat and tidy. Performance management in technology industry is super simple. It's really easy. But suddenly you go into other areas where it's not so easy to identify the skills, customer success, HR, marketing, all of these functions where the skills are a little softer, they're influencing skills or relationship building skills, and how do you validate it? And you're back to feedback because you have to go, well, are you a 10% better influencer now than you were last year? Well, let's ask your colleagues. So you're back into feedback practices again. But there is ways of tying it in, but some people think it's easier than it looks, and it is fraught with complexity to really drive it into your performance practices and make it equitable for everybody across the board. And the other thing is that a lot of the time people are moving their skills at a pace that you can't reward it. You know, so many people are changing and evolving their skills, and there's so many free tools to kind of move your skills along. And what you don't want to create is this expectation that every time the employee gets a new skill, that now I get a new reward and now I'm better. Because it creates this sort of a LinkedIn shouty culture that I now have these 10 skills, which just make me a whole lot more marketable, and I expect my company to pay for that. Not always the case. So I think you have to be careful. I think there's ways you can integrate it really nicely, but you have to be careful not of overshouting it too.
Thank you. There you go, Mike.
Could you say a little bit about what you mean by performance? It's not always clear cut. And the second thing is, we've talked a little bit about giving feedback, which again is a very difficult thing to do well. Bite-sized pieces, all in one lump. How?
So on feedback, you know, a lot of companies have struggled to get to a continuous, the holy grail is continuous feedback, right? That it just happens naturally in the natural flow of work. It's just the way we do things. If we were all a sports team, we'd sit down and watch the video from last week and we'd all be able peer-to-peer give each other feedback on you should have been there and you missed the goal over there and next time you won't do it because you don't want this peer feedback happening again. If we could bring those practices into industry, what could we do in terms of high performance? And all of the high performance studies puts feedback as the central piece of driving high performance. It's the piece that changes us and evolves us and makes us better all the time. But I think too many organizations think it's easy to do, and it's really not. One of the things that we've spent an awful lot of time working on is the behavioral science behind nudging people into feedback practices. And on the technology, we have opportunities where we can nudge people gradually over time. And we like to think of it like there was these studies done in the States on obesity. And they were like, if you're tackling obesity, they recognize that when you hand people loads of nutrition plans and exercise regimes, and you give them the whole formula for tackling their obesity, they don't tend to work. And the people were giving up. But then they studied that when you actually gradually put people into, just put one green vegetable in your curry next time, just put on your sneakers when you get up in the morning, go as far as the door, but then take them off again. So when they gradually layered in lots of little interventions, then actually they saw great success. And it's the same with feedback. That's how we nudge people into feedback. We slowly but gradually get them into giving more and more feedback. We use things like the 5-to-1. And here's the interesting thing. Most of our clients start off with 5-word feedback. So it's like, great job, Dennis. Love the presentation. But the average word count becomes 100 words, because the more people do it, the more habit they have, the more they'll get comfortable with it. The more insightful it will get, the more detailed it will get, the more constructive they'll get, because now they're giving feedback regularly, and most of our clients are in there once a week giving feedback. So if they're layering in praise, then they have that license to go give each other constructive feedback. So it becomes a habit. And that's the key, is if you can get to habitual, continuous feedback, you can make a big, big difference on performance. And that's really what I believe in. Of course, there's natural times where the manager needs to go out before kind of mid-year, end-year conversations and go and get some feedback and objective. But the ideal is that you'd have feedback continuously flowing through the organization. Hope that answers your question.